late and I'm feeling so tired, having trouble sleeping. This constant compromise between thinking and breathing. Could it be I'm suffering because I'm never giving? Won't say that I'm falling in love. Please tell me.
I just want to say, I had that song stuck in my head before we even played it. I don't know what the rest of your day is going to be like. But yes, we're going to talk about sleep today. So usually when a public radio show talks about sleep, they're going to talk about third shift workers and all the health consequences that seem to attend to people who aren't getting the quote unquote right kind of sleep. And in particular, third shift workers, warehouse workers, Amazon workers, there are indications that diabetes, cancer, heart problems, obesity, all of those may be trailing along after the person who isn't sleeping, again, the quote, right, unquote way. We're not doing that show. We are actually going to talk a little bit about where our ideas of sleep come from and whether or not they map very well onto actual human life. And we're also, towards the end, we got us started on this. I read this piece in LitHub about the fact that bears don't hibernate anymore. It turns out, by the way, hibernating and sleeping are not the same thing. But because bears, first of all, because of climate change, but also because bears just live near us. So they've started to sleep or hibernate kind of, in a way that reflects, or not hibernate just because we're just doing stuff all the time and we're putting food out for them to eat all the time. And so why hibernate? Anyway, that's to come. Right now, we're going to begin with Matthew Wolfmeyer, a professor of science and technology studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in New York. He's the author of The Slumbering Masses, Sleep, Medicine, and Modern American Life. So first of all, welcome to our show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So there's this kind of sense, I think, an implied sense that, in Rousseau's Pure State of Nature, everybody sleeps a certain amount of time and they probably sleep in one block or something. There's this kind of idea that if we weren't 21st century schizoid man, we would be sleeping better and differently and quote unquote the right way. Tell us a little bit about where that idea comes from and who gave it to us.
Sure. So it comes from a variety of different sources, and at least in the context of the United States, it's a set of ideas that really develop over the course of the 19th century. So for a long time, you can imagine people lived in relatively agricultural settings, and they were able to sleep without a lot of attention to a clock. And with the rise of industrialization and urbanization, people moved from those agricultural settings into more urban spaces where they were working in factories. And many of those factories depended on the existence of natural light in order for people to be able to work. And so that's why old factories have a ton of windows in them, and people would start the workday around dawn and end the workday around dusk. And that meant that they were staying awake throughout the day, and then being exhausted, they would collapse into sleep at night and sleep through the night so that could go back to work the next day. But previous to that, people were napping throughout the day. They could break their sleep up at night into 2 or more periods. And there's a lot of evidence from the historical record that people slept in a kind of biphasic fashion, meaning that they slept in 2 periods rather than one consolidated period.
Yeah, and I do want to say the king of that theory is Roger Eckhart. By the way, whoever borrowed my copy of At Day's Close by Roger Eckhart, please bring it back. Can't remember who I lent it to, but I can't find it. He's been on this show actually, and he's one of the people who sort of noticed that in the Middle Ages that biphasic thing seemed to be happening. People would sleep for a few hours, they'd wake up, they'd do stuff, they'd write a letter, they'd make love, they'd do whatever. There would be a period of kind of limited activity, but not inactivity, and then they'd sleep some more. So that's like another way to sleep. Again, it might not be the quote right unquote way to sleep.
Yeah, but it's functional. It allows you to check on your kids, check on animals, make sure that the house isn't on fire, if it's warmed by a wood burning stove, right? So, people used biphasic sleep, and, napping throughout the day as needed, I'm a huge proponent of napping. But over the course of the 19th century, because of the needs of American industrialization, there was really this push toward having a consolidated nightly sleep. And that enrolled a bunch of different people, from physicians to politicians to scientists to pastors, to get people to really think that sleeping anything other than in a consolidated way was a form of illness or it was immoral, right? And so by the turn of the 20th century, when modern sleep science really starts to take off, all of those assumptions about consolidated sleep are really baked in to the science and medicine. And so if you look at, public health recommendations in the 1920s, it's all about consolidated sleep, right? That like the idea of napping for adults has totally disappeared. There's no such thing as biphasic sleep. It's just insomnia if you're awake in the middle of the night. And that's what we've really inherited. So by the 1960s and 70s, that had totally intensified into the way that we were thinking about sleep. And by the 90s, with the invention of a lot of the modern sleep drugs, that's the model that everybody is using, that we should be sleeping in a consolidated way at night, not sleeping during the day, and that we're kind of shooting for about 8 hours of sleep, right?
Yeah. And so I'm also wondering what we know historically about sleep configurations and arrangements and accommodations specifically. And actually later in the show, just as a musical intro to a segment, we're going to play Kurt Elling's adaptation of Walt Whitman's poem, The Sleepers. And Whitman, always, kind of radical, is describing, he's narrates himself walking around and looking in windows and seeing how people sleep. And there are a lot of different ways and a lot of different groups of people and a lot of different clusterings of people. We once again have kind of settled on this idea that, it will probably most often be a couple in bed. Their kids will be someplace else. Once again, that feels like maybe something that doesn't necessarily obtain all through history as just priced into the idea of sleep.
Yeah, it's very modern. A lot of families shared beds up until the turn of the 20th century. It really depended on the generation of a lot of wealth for every member of a family to have their own room and to have their own bed. And so, bed sharing is something that a lot of societies do, but Americans don't. And if we look kind of cross-culturally and historically, you can see that it's kind of an accident that Americans sleep the way that they do, that a lot of societies continue to share beds with kids through adolescence. A lot of societies don't have separate rooms for everybody, right? But the challenge that we face is really the historical record. And Roger Ekert's work, other people's work has really focused on what people have written down about their sleep or the sleep of other people. And that's really the only evidence that we have or ever will have about how people slept over the last tens of thousands of years, right? So that historical record is sparse and kind of shaky, but it shows that in the North Atlantic, so a lot of Europe and North America, that people slept in relatively biphasic fashion, and that around the I'm losing words right now.
You haven't enough sleep.
Temperates,
You're sleep deprived. You're losing words.
In equatorial societies, people tend to nap more, that they have a short period of sleep during the night. And then because it's hot during the day, they take a nap during that hot period, right? And so, there's a lot of variation in how humans sleep now and how humans have slept. And it's really hard to say that there's one way that humans have evolved to sleep or that's the right way to sleep.
Yeah. By the way, I'm pretty sure that we're all living in equatorial societies at this point. It's like really hot during the day. So get used to that siesta.
Yeah.
Sure. So Yeah, and I think there's another overlay here, and I was particularly interested to learn that you were in Finland for like a year or something, because there's another overlay here in the U.S., and that is school. School is organized a certain way. I mean, our work lives are organized a certain way, and that way means we get to sleep X amount of time, and under those circumstances, it just seems to work better for work. But there's also school, and school is regimented and organized a certain way, and there are sports at school in the afternoon. And a lot of that seems to drive another form of sleep scheduling, at least in terms of what time we wake up, right?
Yeah, our sleep is really structured by the institutions that we interact with, right? And I wouldn't wake up nearly as early as I do if it wasn't for kids who had to be at school at 7:50 in the morning, right? And you have to be awake for an hour before that. And it's not the best time for them, and it's not the best time for me, but we've decided as a society and in our school district that that's when elementary aged kids need to be at school, right? There's a lot of science around changing sleep needs for kids over their development, and more and more attention to how our sleep needs change over our life course from infancy into old age. And one of the challenges that we face is that the institutional times we interact with are really static, right? That like a 9 to 5 workday might work for some people at some points in their life, but it might not work for everybody over the course of their whole life, right? And the pandemic gave people some options around having more flexible work schedules and working from home. And I would be really interested to see if there's been a decrease in reported sleep disorders over that period and by people who were able to do that stuff. But for a lot of people, there are not those options. And so we really have to fit our sleep into whatever schedule we're working with, which is why a lot of people can't take naps, and why people probably experience things like insomnia and fatigue throughout the day and self-medicate through caffeine and prescription drugs.
Right. And so, listening to you talk now and just, preparing for the show, I wound up thinking about actually a kind of legendary Seinfeld episode called The Nap, and it's all about how George Costanza at his work really does feel like he needs a nap. He eventually has a carpenter come and alter his desk so that he can sleep under his desk. There's room, and so that his boss, George Steinbrenner, won't see him. And then he turns out to like that so much he starts sleeping in cupboards and stuff like that at home. But it's kind of that statement. I mean, every time there's a universal declaration of human rights or workers' rights or anything like that, sleep doesn't really come up on those lists. And the more that you talk, the more I think maybe it should. Maybe it's just sort of a basic aspect of treating a human being like a human being. They should have maybe more sleep options than they do.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. That, and this is part of the challenge with the historical record, right? That like sleep is so banal as an experience that people just don't write about it. And unless something goes wrong, people don't pay a lot of attention to it. And it's true with our diets, and it's true with just our everyday health, but it's especially true with sleep, that like nobody remarked on it for a really long time. And we kind of take it for granted as just this inevitable function that we all experience. And what do we say about it, right? But I think the challenge that George faces in that episode is the kind of moral discourses around right sleeping, right? That like there's some shame associated with being a sleeper who doesn't sleep the way that people think that we should be sleeping, right? And one of the challenges is that we tend to medicalize what we see as being an aberration, right? So like if you need to take a nap, it's not okay morally, and there must be a medical problem that we can treat, right? And getting sleep out of that kind of like moral set of discourses and away from just kind of knee-jerk medicalization is probably the best way we can start to rethink sleep and find better ways to accommodate it in our everyday lives.
Yeah, no, it's interesting how loaded the language is that we use about sleep and about each other's sleep. When I first became involved with a woman who's my lifetime partner now, she would refer to me in conversations with other people. She would say, he's a bad sleeper. And on the other hand, she's comes from a family where I think a lot of the people in the family are biologically wired to want to sleep until 9 or 9:30. I find that disgusting. I find that just like morally offensive. What kind of person does that? But so it's not just that we medicalize it. Like, yeah, you need some Ativan, you need some melatonin, but it's also we pathologize it. And there was a really fascinating article in the Atlantic a couple of years by writer Faith Hill. It was called The Nocturnals. And it turns out there's like a lot of people, or there's not a lot of people, there's a subset of the human race that wants to work the third shift and doesn't really need a lot of human contact, actually, is pretty happy living in an Edward Hopper painting. I know you spent a lot of time doing research into people at night, coming off third shifts in late night diners. You did a period of research where your days your work day ended at 4 a.m. because that's who you were kind of anthropologically looking at. But there's a way in which if that's what you want to do, that can almost seem as pathological. Why doesn't this person want to live the way everybody else does?
Yes, I've spent large swaths of my life being nocturnal, and it works for me in ways that it's not comfortable for everybody, but it's okay with me. And it's really been one of the components of my advocacy that, we should think about how we can organize labor differently so that people can sleep the way that they need and want to sleep, right? That like the idea of a 9 to 5 workday just doesn't work for everybody. And if the choice is working a regular work shift and needing to medicate yourself or drink a ton of caffeine in order to do so, and then face the consequences of like having to drink a ton of caffeine every day or eat a lot of sugar in order to stay awake, or work third shift or second shift and not have to do those things, like we should find ways to make that possible, both for workers and for students and for everybody else, right? That like building more flexibility into our everyday lives in order to meet the needs that we have is a really critical thing to do.
Yeah, and I think at the point that there becomes a pretty large industry that's sending a lot of messages about how much you're sleeping and what you need in order to sleep, or what you need in order to feel a little perkier, it gets harder and harder to get closer to our own basic natures. Although I do remember, I don't know if it still exists, but there was a drug called Lunesta, and they had this commercial where this weird kind of diaphanous moth would fly into people. I used to think that's the most terrifying thing I've ever seen in my life. I couldn't sleep if I knew something like that existed. But there were just a lot of commercials on about this, and commercials exist to make you want something that you currently don't have. And that can be a pretty persuasive way of circulating certain norms.
Yes, absolutely. And really that class of drugs that was developed in the mid to late 90s, and then what really found their ascendancy through the like early 2000s, made billions of dollars for pharmaceutical companies by selling this idea that like, you just need to take a drug in order to sleep better. And, the reality is that for a lot of people who use those drugs, they peter out on their effectiveness pretty quickly. And they have a lot of secondary side effects. And so like, I think we really, we buy into the idea that pharmaceuticals will fix our problem, when what we really need is closer attention to what we individually need and how those needs can be met by the institutions we interact with. But one of the things that they do clinically in order to figure out how people sleep is they let people keep a sleep diary and do something called free running, which is that they just sleep whenever they need to sleep and they wake up whenever they need to wake up, and they don't have an alarm clock, and you just like keep track of how you're sleeping on the diary. And then after a few days of catching up on lost sleep, your sleep kind of normalizes to yourself. And you can see what your actual sleep needs are. And I always tell people that they should try and do that over a vacation period. Like if you've got 2 weeks, just free run with your sleep and see what kind of sleeper you are. Because, so often we really don't know. And if left to our own devices, like we can actually see what our appetite for sleep is, and then use that as a baseline in order to figure out how to organize our lives.
With the time we have left, and there's so many other things I'd love to get into with you, but we should talk a little bit about what happens when people fall asleep when they're not supposed to. So we spend a lot of time telling people, you're supposed to sleep right now. You better go sleep right now because now is when you're supposed to sleep. But there's the other problem. I mean, anybody who's ever been in a class where the teacher decided to show a movie knows the high percentage of people around them who will be asleep. I used to have I used to work for a newspaper where the highest ranking editor loved to go to the theater, but I would see him, at the theater, and he would be sprawled across two seats asleep, publicly falling asleep in group situations where everybody's supposed to be awake. There's a lot of stigma that goes along with that, and I know you have some very specific feelings about it.
Yeah, I mean, I joke with my students that like if they fall asleep in class, that's the political act on their part, right? That they're protesting whatever is happening in that classroom or whatever the structure of their education is by falling asleep. Because like if they're able to fall asleep in a classroom, it's because their needs aren't being met in some fundamental way, right? And it's a really polite form of protest to just fall asleep. I think it's also true for adults. Like if you're in a meeting and that meeting is not utilizing your time in the most respectful way and sleeping would be a better way to use your time, you should go to sleep, right? That like if sleeping is better than whatever is happening, you can protest whatever is happening by just going to sleep, right? And there is the kind of moral stigma around it, but I dare you to have a conversation with people after you have fallen asleep about why you fell asleep in that context, right? Because like that will open up a conversation about needs being met and like the use of time and our expectations of one another. And it just like is a way to puncture all of those assumptions.
All right. Well, I'm watching the producer, Lily Tustin, very carefully through the glass to see whether she's protesting how I'm hosting this show. So far, she seems either she's propped herself up in some way or she's awake. But Matthew Wolfmeyer is a professor of science and technology studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in New York. He's the author of The Slumbering Masses, Sleep Medicine in Modern American Life, among other books. Thank you so much for this conversation. We are going to talk very specifically about non-industrial societies, societies of hunter-gatherers or hunter-horticulturists, and how they sleep in the next segment.
I wandered all night in my vision, stepping with light feet, swiftly and noiselessly stepping and stopping, bending with open eyes over the shadows of sleepers.
Oh, I wish I could play that whole thing for you. That's the thing I was talking about before, Kurt Elling's adaptation of Walt Whitman's poem, The Sleepers. So we're going to talk a little bit about how people sleep. I think there's, once again, this kind of assumption that if we were in our Rousseau-like natural state, we would sleep more, or we would at least sleep differently, we would sleep better. But is that really true? How close can we get to our natural state? Here to talk about that and other things is Gandhi Yetish, a human evolutionary ecologist and anthropologist who studies sleep patterns among small-scale subsistence societies. Welcome to our show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So from from sort of an evolutionary point of view, it might not make sense to be a deep sleeper, right? If we're evolving on the grasslands of Africa, being deeply asleep seems like a really bad idea. Being a little bit more vigilant seems like a good idea, both in terms of predators and, who might be getting after us, but also what you would refer to, I think, as an opportunity cost, too. You want to be awake when there's a chance to maybe get some food or get something that your group desperately needs. So can you say a little bit more about that, about how sleep works for us as a species?
Sure. Certainly we have preconceptions about what we need to do. And it seems like deep sleep would be kind of inhibiting of other things that we need to do, and yet we all do it. But if we try to take a step back and be aware of our own assumptions of what we're used to and take a broader perspective, deep sleep is just something that happens. So we have to choose when we're going to do it. There's no law that says it has to even be at night. Many species are nocturnal and they're awake at night and sleep during the day. And so we think pretty clearly that humans are not like that. But then the question is, well, what is normal? And it turns out to be a very messy question to answer, because how do you even define what normal is? I've been spending the better part of the last 10 years or so spending couple years at least in the field, and I've been working in Bolivia, Namibia, and Tanzania with the Chimane, the San, and the Hadza groups. And all three groups, for those who are not familiar, they are called subsistence societies, which would include hunter-gatherers. The San and Hadza are hunter-gatherers. The Chimane also have small-scale horticulture, which is gardening with hand tools, basically, as opposed to having cows or tractors. And in these groups, in contrast to what Matthew was saying in the first segment, there are very few institutions that people are interacting with on a daily basis. They don't even really have money that they're, interacting with on a daily basis. Their full-time job is getting food, you could say, if you were to try to put it into the language that we're familiar with. So in that context, where you don't have a boss telling you have to show up at a certain time, you don't have school, you don't have any of these social obligations, when should you sleep? And that's kind of the context where I've been doing my research. And the reason that I've picked these groups, or that we've picked these groups, that people in my field work in these situations, is that the ancestors of these groups, just like our ancestors, would have also been living in a subsistence type of society where they're not working to get money to buy food. They're just working to get food. And when you're living in the natural environment, trying to forage, trying to feed yourself, you do need to sleep. So how do people do it today? We can try to consider this a reasonable place to start when we try to extrapolate and guess backwards through time what people may have been doing, especially since so many of these social institutions that are so important for affecting sleep today, we know have only been around for a few decades, a few hundred years. Maybe if you want to be really generous, you'd say a few thousand years. But human history has lasted, as a species, biologically speaking, for 300,000 years. I mean, we're just dealing with an entirely different scale. And so we're really trying to take a lot of step backs and peel off the layers of the onion to understand sleep in a more deeper level here.
So let's look at something that's a fairly recent advent, and that would be artificial lighting, electric lighting, whatever we want to call it. That's 150 years old, maybe, unless you count gas lighting, maybe a little bit older. But so the societies that you're looking at, as I understand it, do not have electric lights. It gets dark at a certain point, but So one might assume, okay, so they probably go to sleep, I don't know, an hour after it gets dark or something. That's not what they do, right?
That's right. People tend to, if I can try to paint a picture for you, you work all day, you're collecting food, you bring it back home, which is where your children are running around, your parents might be there, your cousins, your uncles and aunts, kids of all ages, they're all there. And you've got a couple of central hearths, typically one per household, whatever a household means in that context. I don't want to get into it. And someone starts cooking generally close to dusk with all these foods that have been collected. And as it gets darker and darker, people stop what they're doing. They come sit by the fire. They wait for the food to finish because everybody's hungry. And then as it's ready to eat, they all eat. It's already dark by the time they're finished eating. They continue to sit by the fire, chatting, what have you. And then as people get tired, they kind of peel off on their own and they leave the conversation to go to bed. So essentially what ends up happening is people are going to bed about 3 hours after sunset. And then they tend to sleep throughout the night, but they do frequently wake up. They're interrupted by any number of things. Some things seem exotic, such as, the sound of lions roaring or hyenas or, even just dogs for those who have them. But others are very relatable, such as babies that are hungry or babies that need a change or whatever. These are all things that people have to deal with, even in these contexts. And they wake up maybe once or twice a night. They deal with whatever they have to deal with. And then they wake up to start their day, generally around dawn.
So the study participants also are wearing, as I understand it, small wristband devices that could track sleeping and waking times and light exposure. First of all, so you just described a pattern, 3 hours after sundown, waking up before dawn. How many hours of sleep does that add up to typically?
Typically, that adds up to between 6 and 7 hours. The figure that we typically cite is 5.7 to 7.1 hours of actual sleep. So we're definitely in the range of what people are doing in the West. But just as you interpret these numbers of 6 or 7 hours of sleep per night, I'd just like to add the caveat for context that we normally colloquially say, I went to sleep at 11 o'clock and I woke up at 6 o'clock, when really you went to bed at 11 o'clock and you got out of bed at 6 o'clock. And it's a normal part of the sleep cycle to spend a certain amount of time awake, which is generally about an hour. So if you were thinking that you slept from 11 to 6 and you say that's 7 hours of sleep, that's actually more like 7 hours in bed, which is maybe more like 6 hours of sleep. And
Right.
So that's the context I would give you for interpreting 6 or 7 hours of sleep per night for these people in the field, because it's almost the same.
Right. And as I understand it, that 6 to 7 hours fluctuates a little bit with the seasons, 6 hours in the summer when there's more light, maybe 7 hours in the winter when there's less. But, this is all kind of radical weighed against what we're just told all the time, which is that 8 hours of sleep is the minimum amount that a human being needs to avoid other kinds of health consequences. And yet, and I think the underlying that is an assumption, well, wow, if I didn't, stay up watching Succession all night and then I didn't have to get up so early in the morning to go to my stupid job, blah, 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 I'd be getting 8 hours of sleep. It doesn't really sound like we're necessarily wired for that 8 hours.
Well, I would say that in terms of giving people recommendations to get enough sleep, if you told them that they needed to get 8 hours of sleep and they went to bed at 11, they woke up at 7, they would probably end up getting about 7 hours of sleep in those 8 hours in bed. And public health research suggests that about 7 hours tends to be associated with the best health outcomes. So in terms of public policy, it's very difficult to make recommendations, and they should not be ever interpreted as a one-size-fits-all type of solution. But they are generally reasonable, in my opinion. But I would say that what I've described is a common pattern, but people don't follow the common pattern every night. There's an incredible amount of variation in sleep, even from night to night within the same week in these places where I'm working. I mean, you would think that the sun sets at the same time every night and sun rises at the same time every morning, but from day to day, there's a huge variation. And so what I've been kind of looking at in terms of opportunity costs is, well, if why does it vary so much? What are people doing? And the general framework I've been looking at is if you're responding to things that are happening in your environment that are very sporadic and unpredictable, then it may be a good thing to actually be able to respond to them. Certainly in terms of dangers like a house fire or what have you, is something you would want to wake up and deal with. It'd be much preferable to that sleeping through the fire. And in the same way, I would say that, you know, if you sleep through a baby crying, that might be better for your sleep, but it's probably worse for the baby. But there are also other things, like if you're trying to get food and there's somebody else in your community comes home with a bunch of meat because they've been hunting at night, that's a great opportunity to wake up and go get some and socialize and, you know, hear whatever stories they have to tell. And so if that's kind of what was normal, quote unquote, whatever that means, if that's something that people could have been dealing with for thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, then there may be some degree of flexibility into our own endogenous sleep regulation systems that would have been shaped this way by these conditions over that period of time. And now, because we have that same kind of programming, when a new episode of Succession comes out, I mean, we're definitely going to stay up to watch it. I don't want to wait until morning. I want to watch it now.
And new Harry Potter books. I mean, my God. So this is all fascinating stuff. And thank you so much, Gandhi Yetish, a human evolutionary ecologist and anthropologist who studies sleep patterns among small-scale subsistence societies. We're going to talk about animals in the next segment. I just want to say right now, because a lot of the people who listen to this show, their first question, because they listen to the show, is what about tapirs or tapirs? Well, Malayan tapirs are crepuscular, which means they are active at dawn and at dusk. In the middle of the day and in the middle of the night, they sleep. So you can try being a tapir for a couple of days, see if that works for you. We'll take a little break. We'll come back. We'll tell you what's happening to animals who hibernate or maybe don't.
I don't need no headaches or DTs. I'll dig these satchels underneath my eyeballs. Now, if I'm going to get rid of these, I better get me some seeds. I better get me some seeds. I better get me some seeds. Good night.
And our technical producer today is Kat Pastor. The producer of this episode is the senior producer of the Colin McEnroe Show, Lily Tyson, who's having trouble sleeping lately. It's another reason we're doing the show. But the other reason was this article I mentioned at the beginning that was in LitHub for some reason. But it's also a part of my experience. I was talking to somebody the other day who said that, so, I mean, as most of you know, here in Connecticut, bears are just kind of everywhere all the time. They're coming to your house, they play the piano, they do whatever they want to do. But this woman was telling me that on LeMay Street in West Hartford, there was this bear who just spent the whole winter in a tree, like just up there, just in the tree, not in a cave or anything like that. And that they had named him LeMay, and they would just say, hey, you want to drive over and look at LeMay for a while? He's up in a tree. So then we read this article about, in fact, how bears are not necessarily hibernating these days. And then we started wondering about other animals. And, of course, the first categorical mistake that we made is about to be corrected by Cory Williams, an associate professor in the Department of Biology at Colorado State University. So when Lily Tyson and I were talking about this show, Lily said, well, like the animals can't get any sleep either. We can't sleep. They can't sleep. Well, it turns out, and I didn't know this either, that it's a mistake to conflate hibernation and sleep. Cory Williams, tell us more about that.
Yeah, so hibernation and sleep are actually quite different. We know this from studies using EEG. And so with EEG, you can see non-rapid eye movement sleep, and you can see rapid eye movement sleep or REM sleep. in humans and other animals. But when we look at hibernators, we see something that looks a little bit like non-rapid eye movement sleep as they enter hibernation, but then their EEGs don't look similar at all to REM sleep or non-REM sleep. So we think that these animals are actually not sleeping during hibernation. And when we look at small mammal hibernators, they don't spend the entire winter with cold body temperature in this hypometabolic state. They warm themselves up every few weeks. And they do this for about 24 hours. And it turns out what they do mostly during that 24 hours is sleep. So they might actually need to periodically stop being hypometabolic just so they can go through these sleep processes.
So stop hibernating and sleep a little bit so you can go back to hibernating. That's not the way we had been thinking about it. We had the paradigm all wrong. So obviously sleep happens in the winter. There are some reasons for that, including the diminished amount of light, significantly diminished in certain areas. But along with that is cold. You're talking about that hypometabolic state. So everything's getting warm. As I said earlier in the show, we're all living in equatorial societies right now. It's very, very warm. What is that doing? You are particularly studying Arctic ground squirrels. So tell us a little bit about what's going on with them.
So Arctic ground squirrels are obligate hibernators. So they hibernate every year. And even if you put them in, unusual conditions, so you give them like an equatorial photoperiod and warm temperatures, they're still going to go through a period where they're trying to hibernate. But other species, like bears, for instance, are really plastic in terms of their hibernation. So if they have sufficient food in particular, they often won't hibernate during those winter months. And so if you look across, the range that we find bears in, the more southern locations, bears won't hibernate at all, whereas in the more northern locations, they're hibernating a lot. And so what we see with climate change is that this changes temperature, of course. It also changes resource availability. And so when there's more food around, they're going to hibernate less.
So there's also, for the ground squirrels, a difference between when the males get up and when the females get up. At least traditionally there is. And I don't want to violate the privacy of Arctic ground squirrels, but we should just say that for the males, as I understand it, their testicles shrivel up in the fall, and then they have to kind of regrow and redescend after hibernation. Cory?
Yeah, so this is actually true of a lot of mammals that are going to breed seasonally. They will go through what we call a seasonal puberty. So they're going through something akin to puberty each year. And in a hibernator, they're doing that. They're initiating that late in hibernation, and then immediately after hibernation stops. So what we see in ground squirrels is males actually hibernate for a shorter interval, and they end hibernation earlier because it takes them about a month to go through this puberty so that they're ready to mate with females once they finished hibernating. And what we're seeing with climate change is that females are actually ending hibernation earlier, whereas males are not. And so at the moment, that's not creating any issues. But as climate change continues, we expect that females will actually be ready to mate with males before those males are sexually mature and able to mate with those females.
Right. It's starting to feel like this whole show is about George Costanza. Now we're talking about shrinkage. But yes, that could be a very awkward thing. I just don't happen to be ready, honey, to make any new squirrels quite yet. So, I mean, levity aside, this has serious implications. And how much of a change are you seeing over how much of a period of time? It seems as though climate change is kind of accelerating the rate of what we might think of as, quote unquote, normal change within a species.
Yeah, so over the last 25 years, females are now ending hibernation about 10 days to 2 weeks earlier in response to climate change, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually a pretty meaningful difference in a pretty short amount of time. And The Arctic, of course, is warming faster than any other part of the globe, and so they're experiencing climate change at a much more rapid pace.
So, yeah, I mean, that is a lot in a very short amount of time when you think about sort of the overall stability of a species normally. So bears have an additional problem, right? Not only is it maybe not as cold, but bears are living much closer to us. Bears are not necessarily tempted to use hibernation. Not that they would think this out necessarily, but hibernation as a way of redressing food scarcity. Well, like, we got food for them all the time. All they have to do is find a garbage can. We don't stop putting the garbage out during the winter. I assume that's messing with the bears as well.
Yeah, so access to food can definitely influence hibernation. And so you've got two things that are happening. We're providing more food to them, so they're hibernating less. And then also under climate change, they might be hibernating less. And so they're interacting with humans more because they're spending less time in hibernation. So it's sort of this circle that's happening where we are impacting the bears, and then the bears in turn are having more conflict with humans.
Right. And we should say a little bit more about the other purposes of hibernation and maybe the differences between species. I mean, ground squirrels, as I understand it, have a somewhat more, I don't know, a programmed approach to hibernation than bears do. Like, it sort of makes sense when you think about it, because maybe ground squirrels don't want to be out where, they can be eaten by other animals. But in other words, ground squirrels are going to try to essentially hibernate as long as they can. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, it depends on the species, but ground squirrels in general are what we call obligate hibernators. So they have, very programmed hibernation, and they have some plasticity in how long that hibernation is, but they're not nearly as flexible as other animals like bears. But there's other small mammals as well that are also really flexible, like some species of chipmunks are highly flexible in terms of how much they hibernate.
So for the ground squirrels, is this going to have obvious consequences? I mean, we talked about the sort of the reproductive thing, which could sort of just knock them a little bit off their game in that way. But are there other ways in which, if ground squirrels continue to do what they're doing, if they start kind of coming out of hibernation earlier and earlier and earlier because of warming temperatures, are there other concerns for them because of this?
Well, one way in which they can potentially be impacted is by predators. So as you mentioned before, they're relatively safe when they're hibernating. And so they have a higher survival rate during hibernation than they do in what we call the active season. And so as the active season gets longer and hibernation gets shorter, that can potentially have a negative impact. And these animals only breed one time per year. So they're not capable of having a second litter or anything like that to make up for that survival loss.
Yeah, and with the bears, let me just say, everywhere around here in Connecticut, there's this understanding that you take your bird feeders in during the warm months, and then you can put them back out in the winter because the bears are hibernating. Well, if they're not hibernating, you may never be able to feed the birds, or you might have just changed your metrics about that somehow. So we're learning, we're changing, and maybe not necessarily for the good. But Cory Williams, an associate professor in the Department of Biology at Colorado State University, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.
And to the rest of you, stop worrying about how much you sleep and then go have a nap.